Welcome back to Neutrality Studies, today again with Chandran Nair, a Malaysian scholar and the founder of the Global Institute for Tomorrow. Chandran recently published the book Understanding China, Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence. Chandran, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal, for having me back. Deeply honored. Thank you.
Thanks for coming back online again. Very happy to have you. And we will talk about your book in a moment, but we have to start with Davos. I mean, it's not because it's in my home country, but because it is so ridiculous. All of the pronouncements that are coming from there. And on the one hand, you have people like the Prime Minister of Canada saying like, this is over. This whole show is not in our interest anymore. We should give up the charade. He used the word charade, I think. And you have Macron basically giving a talk. We have now his text message in which he says, look, we're fine with subduing the world outside of Europe, but please don't do it to us. And then we have Donald Trump speaking in a really, really bizarre way. What are you making out of all of this?
Well, I think, at one level, it's highly amusing. On another level, sitting in this part of the world, it looks like we live in parallel universes. There is the Western world made up of the United States and Europe. And dare I say, though it might sound a bit churlish, that people are looking at this growing tension between the USA and Europe with great interest, because I think few of us imagined in our lifetimes that we would actually see this sort of thing happen. But perhaps the most important thing, one of the things that struck me yesterday, and I never want to watch any of this stuff, but I had friends from around the world text me to say, you got to turn the TV on and watch the show. I mean, they used cruder words to describe it. So after about 10 messages, I turned it on to see what was going on, and I saw the regime leader of the United States, if I can put it that way, speaking in this usual rambling way. And that's to be expected. I didn't expect anything else. But what was really interesting, I captured, was a sentiment that he made, and which I caught at the end. And it's on record that he essentially was saying that we, the Western world, need to protect ourselves from the rest. And I was wondering about who else is in the audience. I mean, of course, typically in Davos, the power is with the Western world membership. But he was very clear. I would go as far as to say that he made a sort of white supremacist sort of declaration that Western civilization is the best in the world. We need to return it to its pinnacle. We are the people who created all the great wealth in the nation. I mean, ignoring the history of plundering that created a lot of that wealth, and we have to protect ourselves. So one was the left, people like me, and I'm sure there are hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the world who are not from the Western world, but also I'm sure people in the West who thought the Western world needs to be protected from home. At the moment, it seems to need protection from itself. And essentially, it's blood brother, if you want to call it, and needs protection from that. So I was almost going to say something today to say the WEF, the WEF, needs to be called the WWEF, the Western World's Economic Forum, because that's what it turned out to be. And then when he's finished speaking, I think the chairman of the WEF sat down with him in a most sort of awkward manner, almost treating him as though he was his guru, his teacher, his leader, and asking the most sort of simplistic questions, to which, as usual, the leader of the United States went off tangent and gave very obtuse, sort of strange answers. But it was that relationship that you could see was so subservient. So the other message to the world that this sort of events gave, given particularly as the first sort of global event where the Europeans, the Americans came together and was telecast around the world since the statement by the United States, we're going to take Greenland, was how subservient the Europeans have become. And that's really damning for the rest of the world to see. So I think these are all really important signals. If I might say one more thing, I thought the the Canadian Prime Minister's statement was a good one, but it was slightly rich coming from a country that is only 40 million people, has had a disproportional place in the table that he talked about, because he said something quite interesting, and he said, if you're not at the main table, you're on the menu. Well, for most of us in the rest of the world, the 80%, in Canada is part of the G7, for people who don't know, a country with just 40 million people, or 42 million, just because it's part of the white settler community. 42 million people at the G7. And finally, the Canadians have woken up to the fact that actually now they need to look to the rest of the world. You know that he went to Beijing and made peace, which is very sensible. But I wondered if he reflected on the history and thought, when he said, if you're not at the main table, you're on the menu. Well, most of us have been on your menu, including Canada's menu. Canada's been in G7. We've all been excluded. The G20, the majority of the world. So I hope this sort of reflection will be something that takes place in the corridors of power in both places like Canada, Australia, and of course in Europe. So it was it was both good to see in a sort of perverse sort of way the tensions building within the Western alliance, but at the same time sad to see how weak Europe had become, and why Europe was not prepared to stand up and say no, and actually be quite diplomatic, but quite tough with the Americans when they turned up on your soil.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video. It's, there's this mix of feelings, right? On the one hand, the Europeans and Canada too kind of deserve this moment. They deserve a feeling just subdued and powerless and off guard, because that's what they did for 500 years, the Europeans, for 500 years to everybody else, and being talked down to top down, right? That's the way that Donald Trump is doing it. On the other hand, we all understand that this is not healthy, right? And if that what we would want is a properly functioned globe, not one in which now the former colonizer, is being colonized. That doesn't help that much overall. How do you think the formerly colonized world is looking at this? People who, and we talked about this last time, right? Europe's inability to understand that colonialism isn't over, and that the rest of the world is not just forgetting about this experience. Plus, it's ongoing, right? The way that a good part of the world is being still until this day heavily exploited, and France, the queen of not letting go, still directly involved in Africa and very, very heavy-handed around the world wherever it can. And now on the other end, they now have a place where they cannot, and where they are starting to be on the shorter end of the stick. How do you think the rest of the world is now interpreting this?
Well, at one level, surprised, because no one expected this to come to fruition so soon. I have said for many years, even speaking in Europe, going back 10 years, that Europe should decouple from the United States. That doesn't mean be the enemy of the United States, though recently US politicians and European commentators have said we have an enemy, it's called the United States. But I said decouple so that your options are much wider, both in foreign policy, trade, and you look at the world very differently. But it refused to. So for most of the world, it's a bit of a surprise. To be honest, I think a lot of people are slightly glad, because to see that the relationship is beginning to devour itself. And at some level, the analogy one might use is an abusive marriage or a partnership, where one partner has been abusing the other for so long. The weaker partner has been dependent because there's some riches to be gained, membership to the club, the big house, whatever, the expenses are all paid for, etc. but takes the abuse. And we all know how that works out typically, and it ends in tragedy quite often, or a lot of pain. But so the European US relationship is now being seen in many parts of the world, and I can't speak for everyone, as wow, this is really an abusive relationship. But the other partner, the Europeans, the weak partner in this, seems to be a sucker for pain and abuse and is willing to take it. And I think one of the other things that's going on, and we've seen this in the last few years, that as the criticism, the incessant criticism of China, we've seen from Europe and the U.S. particularly, has grown, the American behavior has actually put China in a much better light. We've seen in the last 2 3 years, right? Especially in Asia. That is not to say China does not have, the things it needs to do. But what it has also done, I think, in my view, is made people understand, well, which is the one country that did stand up to the Americans for the last 10 years. But when it came to the tariffs, which country stood up and said, no, it didn't blink, was China, right? It took the pain. But then you have India that also, didn't do what China did because perhaps it doesn't have the muscle in the cloud, but also didn't give in. So look, people around the world are looking, and then smaller countries like South Africa said, no, we're not going to be bullied. And then people are looking at Europe and said, well, your economy collectively is almost the size of the United States. Why don't you call their bluff? I think that's the biggest discussion I've been having in the last 24 hours with people from this part of the world, thinking, how come the Europeans will not say, go for it, let's call your bluff and see what happens? And so I think there's much more respect than for what China did.
Yeah.
But it's quiet diplomacy, no shouting, no calling names. And then the Canadians, and in the week that the Canadians came back, and that also sent a very strong message across the world. Wow, China stayed calm and just said, we will hunker down. But we are open. We'll have open arms to anybody who wants to, respect us. And no matter how small they are, Canada is small. Let's face it, compared to China, we will treat them with respect, which is what you would expect any state that is, superpower to behave and understand. That's their role in sort of the global geopolitics.
Yeah. And I maybe need to add one thing when I say that the Europeans deserve this. What I actually meant is that these European elites deserve this, because like as with a lot of these power structures, like also within the states, usually the poor population is the one that's just as exploited as the ones abroad, right? But what we are seeing now is that these elite circles are actually starting to be like on the being pretty much beaten by the US, right? And put in their place. And maybe this connects to something that you said you would like to discuss, and which I think is important, and that's this political rot that we are seeing. That there's no leaders in Europe. I mean, none. Like the best we have at the moment is like I would say Spain and Ireland, where people are a little bit like on the political level willing to say no to Israel and actually call out a genocide. I mean, for Christ's sake, it's a genocide, and they are not able to kind of get their marbles together and say like, no, we all signed that we're not going to do this anymore. How do you connect these dots?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to take up on the point that you mentioned about the European elites, because, at times when I refer to the Western world, because when it's writing and speaking like that, one can't qualify everything one says. And I get rightly and I accept the feedback. Hey, we're not all the same. I understand, but I also say that I didn't coin the phrase the Western world. But if you look at the European and Western elites, and I wrote a piece for the Counterpunch last week about the derangement in the United States, and I said the American society as a whole has become deranged. I mean, where are the massive protests? Where is the ability to take down someone as as destructive as the current president? But if you look at Europe, yesterday there was also a report that surfaced this morning all over, saying that the central bank chief, Miss Lagarde, walked out of a dinner where the Commerce Secretary of the US was essentially absolutely rude about Europeans, insulting Europeans, and walked out. And in a short interview, she said something to the effect that what we are seeing, and this is pretty in line with what the Canadian Prime Minister said, is the curtains raising on the New World Order.
Mhm.
And I want to say that, what people like us think, and I don't speak for everyone, but those of us who watch these matters in Asia, I think the Middle East, Africa, that curtain was raised a while back. You were just looking. You refused to look, and you did not like what you saw. So you tried to pull the curtain down. You threw rubbish at it. You insulted it. You tried to burn it down. And now you found out that you actually can't burn it down. And you're only recognizing it when one of your own is essentially become what you think is the new world order, because they are behaving in such a way that you think that's the new world order. But the new world order is not the behavior of the Americans. The new world order was the transformation, mostly positive, taking place in the global majority, regaining their sovereignty against all the other impediments in their way, with all their problems, bad governance, etc. But that new world order has been shaping for at least 10 years. But you never looked. And in fact, you tried to take it down. So two, people like the elites in Europe who said, now we have a new world order. No, it's been around. You just didn't want to look at it, and you try to tear it down. And now you're confronted with what you think is the new order because your big brother is behaving so badly. And you never thought that would happen. And until your big brother behaved really badly, you thought there was no new world order because you wanted to retain the old order, and you didn't want to look at the positive side of change, because that change was coming from people that you didn't ever want to see as your equal. And now you're being forced to by your big brother because your big brother is behaving like a rogue. And I think this is also something that, we'll all talk about. Where have these people been? To your point about the European elites and the liberal elites in the United States who are talking about these things. And coming back to, I think the governor of California said something to the effect that coming to Davos, he was surprised at how spineless the Europeans are in terms of not standing up. Well, that's also very rich coming from an American, given that this person who is said who is calling the big bully is one of yours. Where were all of you Americans? And if anyone should have a spine in taking him down or reining him in, surely it should start with the Americans. So that on that point, I'm with the Europeans who you should stand up. But it's rich for any American to say that the Europeans had no spine when they become the Congress and Senate have become spineless, unable to control, and in fact just bow to one person and his mob.
And if we frame this, if we frame colonialism as this long period starting somewhere in the, 1400s or so, what we saw actually is this tag team approach at managing the globe, right? And you have one colonial empire handing over the reins voluntarily, involuntarily to the other, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the British. They compete at the same time, but differently. The Dutch, and then tag team to the United States, which then has a little colonial war with the Spaniards, takes away the Philippines and Cuba and the possessions, but continues, of course, the repression, kills 500,000 Filipinos in the process in order to
I think it's
keep the
closer to
countries.
a million. I think
Or
it's close to a million, actually.
Sorry, I don't have the numbers
No, no, I'm not correcting
but
you, but I
it's
remember.
absolutely
Yeah.
that. And raiding in Africa and raiding the West Asia, and it's happening until today, and then tag team to give it over to Israel and the United States, and rain down bombs and destruction and whatnot. And so if we look at it like that, and from my own research, I know Switzerland was always part of that. It did secondhand colonialism. It was present everywhere where the others were, where you had colonial jurisdiction. They would go and they would do the trade that the big ones don't want, but take up the pieces. So it was always been a very European enterprise, and is in a way, I feel that this one is coming to an end because the tag team approach doesn't work anymore. There's nobody who can take over like the US did in the early 20th century and still keep imposing the structure. Do you see it like that as well?
Well, and you've articulated that very well, because that is not well understood by many in this part of the world. Many of the global majority, don't want to look back.
Mm.
We want to look forward, but you have to look back to understand. And I think the last couple of few years have rekindled in the minds of those of us who, studied a bit of history and understand what you just said. My God, is this really a replay of the same? And how does it get replayed? Is there some manual that these guys look at and they replicate the business model? But it's somehow in that sort of perverse nature of how power continues to perpetuate
Mhm.
itself from one generation to the other.
Mhm.
And as a friend, as I was discussing with a friend, I mean, why is there so much fear in the Western world? I mean, epitomized by the American fear. Americans are driven by fear, fear of the whole world. Why is there so much fear in the Americans and the Europeans? And at one level, one can't help but think, and what you was talking about, that they fear that a world in which they do not have vastly superior economic and military power over the rest is one in which the others who are equal to them or who replace them in terms of that power, and this is the catch, will do to them what they did to others.
Yeah,
And I think that's ingrained in the centuries of what you just described.
yeah,
But they don't understand that, and I think this is not wishful thinking. I think human societies around the world have changed. We have advanced. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble.
Y-
That doesn't mean there aren't bad actors. But the idea that we will revert to an 18th, 17th century colonization, where some country like China will go and exterminate large numbers of people somewhere, take over the United States or take over countries. I mean, that's over, but it's still ingrained in the psyche
yeah.
of the establishment of elites in the West. And I think, some of us talk about this. Is this the fear that drives them to continuously see the world, those others, as a threat? And is it what has kept the bond between the Europeans, it's which you described, and the Americans, and then Americans became the most powerful power, the Europeans' powers sort of receded, and then they had this contract, this abusive contract, the abusive partner, and now that is breaking. Now, if it does break, then truly it will, in my view, be a good thing. It'll be a good thing for everyone. It'll not just be a good thing for the rest of the world. I believe, it'll be it'll be good for the Europeans. And I've always advocated the Europeans that they are an old civilization, diverse. They understand the world better than the Americans. There's a lot of respect for Europeans in different parts of the world, despite the history. And all of that can be essentially, not buried, but sort of reckoned with in a new world in which we work together as equals. And I think Europeans need to come to terms with that. And if this is the breach that is happening, then it's very good for the world. The
Mm.
question is, will the Europeans be bold enough to make that breach and break away? And
It's
be a bloc that treats equally the rest of the world and doesn't see their protection from home, and their security and prosperity has linked purely to the military and economic might of what I can only call a rogue state, the United States.
Yeah, it's probably. I mean, it is hard. I guess it must be very hard for many, even if they are not conscious about it. But the shift from being part, of the extended, let's say, British Empire on which the sun never sets, which is like 120, 130 years ago, was still very much, how the world was running, to becoming like what Glenn Deason in one of his books, my colleague in Norway, said, like, the Western Peninsula of the northwestern peninsula of the Eurasian continent. I guess that must be a very tough shift for many
It is
people.
very tough.
Plus the fear that the others will do to you what you did to them, and so you double down. And that, to me, like, what we see with Gaza and the idea of the Board of Peace, that's then let's transform Gaza into a modern day UN protectorate, which is like 100 years back
Same old stuff.
idea.
Same old stuff.
It's like but it's kind of the last kind of let's try again.
Yes, yes. And that's where this possibly is the breach. Let's see. I read something this morning saying that the British Prime Minister said he will not bow to the Americans' demands about Greenland. Various others have said the same thing. Let's see. Now, it would appear to me, and when I'm in discussions, or in just the last few days talking to European friends, I said, call his bluff, because you must know that it would be an almighty risk. And I gather, and I sense, and I may be wrong, the American institutions are weak and broken, but they're not completely broken, that they will not allow the current president to essentially, use military force. So call his bluff. And but will the Europeans call the bluff, and that way, stand tall? There are indications that some of them are saying so. I don't know, but things are moving very fast. But one thing that one has noticed, and some say that is probably driven by markets, because there's one thing that guy understands in the most simplistic way, is he doesn't understand the implications of what he says on markets. But when the markets start to react, his people say, hey, boss, something's going south. You got to do something. So he sort of slightly stepped back yesterday to say, and it shows you the world we live in. It's so fickle, but the markets rebounded within like a few hours. That's the silly world we live in. But I hope the Europeans will call his bluff and stand firm
Yeah,
and say no.
I mean,
I think that's the turning point for the world in terms of the US-European relationship.
the Chinese called his bluff when it came to the tariffs, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
he did stand down. So one thing that he seems to be doing, like, intuitively, is he constantly tries to throw everybody off the ball, right?
Yes.
And then he proposes the next ludicrous thing and doubles down until people take that one serious, and then he goes to the next one. It goes to the next one. He constantly shatters the China for everybody. But yeah, I mean, the Indians also said, like, no, we're not taking this. So we do have now
Yeah,
case.
so that's what I mean by why can't the European leaders, and maybe it comes to your point, there's just no strong leadership, say, yeah, go for it. We're strong, we're Europeans, and we have a long history of involvement with the world. We have relationship around the world. We will do differently. I will give, he's not European, but I'll give the Canadian Prime Minister, credit for standing up and saying, no, we will not be bullied. We're small, and we will go and trade with others. And he had the diplomatic skills and, fortunately, the grace of China to say, well, you did, you were quite obnoxious to us with the Huawei kidnapping of the daughter. I mean, it was a kidnapping, but we'll be gracious and welcome you and give you all the state welcome and see what we can do. And I think more Europeans should do that and call the bluff of the U.S. president, because I don't think he can carry on this way, because every day he's going to change his mind about something. You have to treat this as theater. But your point is very clear. Do European leaders have the stomach?
I mean, no,
for this period of, being bold and playing the game.
it's not a happy place to be in, but and in a sense, it's something that a lot of other leaders try to avoid, right? To create this theater. I mean, I have this very strong feeling that most of the politicians in Europe these days, of these elites, they are policymakers. They think
Yeah.
in policies, and that's not a good type of leadership. What you want is strategists who try to, move in the right direction, not people who try to micromanage stuff like the EU does. But that brings us maybe to China and to the book that you wrote, together with a couple of others, Understanding China. Like the Chinese way of leadership, it to me seems internally, let's say internally, one of setting goalposts and setting aspirations, and then trying to motivate the rest to kind of follow that and achieve those goals. How do you how would you explain the Chinese approach at politics in contrast to what the Europeans and the Americans are doing?
Thank you for mentioning the book because and I'm glad the book came out this time because as I said before, I think most people are looking and saying, how come the Chinese have not behaved so badly? In a way, they've behaved with great dignity, but what is it that allows that system to operate in this way?
Mm,
And the book, in a simple way, tries to explain, as you know, as well as I do, most books in China seek to criticize it or praise it in a way that's more, almost propaganda. And we wanted to write a book that allowed people to come to their own conclusions. But because the book is not critical of China, there are those who think it's therefore pro China and therefore they miss the whole point. So, to your point about the Chinese, how China is able to behave that way, firstly, I think the very important thing to understand is you can't understand China by looking at it through the sort of narrative of Western political systems and governance systems. It's a completely different system.
mm,
And you have to understand that. And one of the key things to understand is that the Chinese system is extremely focused on meritocracy.
mm,
The Western narrative has simply been, and the simplistic propaganda, oh my God, they're a bunch of communists and they're oppressing everybody and they're taking everyone's rights away. Well, you can't be a bunch of autocrats, commies with no understanding, without great capabilities, oppressing everyone, and take 800 million people out of poverty and create what is unprecedented in human history. You can't get slaves to do that. So you had a population which supported a system. That system is not perfect. But what the Chinese understood in terms of a social contract is that we support you as a leadership through our system, and legitimacy is through performance. And the performance has been stellar by any measure. And as long as you keep on doing that, and that doesn't mean we should all get rich, but what is the Chinese concerned about would be that standards of living have improved remarkably, access to education, technology, security, and freedoms, which didn't exist before. But it's not the freedoms that are defined through the Western lens simply, because the Chinese average person understands that in a highly densely populated country in the urban areas, etc., you can't have the same freedoms that you could have in different ways. But there's a lot of freedom in China too to do certain many things, which the book looks at. So the Chinese system has essentially, evolved around a focus on a communitarian sort of approach to building the nation with the most capable people there. So you will not get a situation. And I don't want to go back to the sort of mediocrity of the leadership in the United States for at least 25 years. I think one of the reasons the United States and Europe has come to this stage, as we've discussed, is that the United States in particular has not been able to produce leaders of high quality. They just simply haven't. Because the system is not based on meritocracy, it's not based on capability, it's based on rhetoric, money, it's drenched in party politics. So that's the difference. And you're accountable every day of the week for results. And that's why the Chinese president or premier or any senior Chinese person doesn't go on TV and make pronouncements which have not been studied in depth and which can be delivered, because the moment you say it, then it's sort of part and parcel of policy, and it has to be delivered. And it has to be delivered on the basis that they are serving the societal communitarian needs of the country.
Yeah, and this there was this recent event that reminded me that some parts of the world do work differently, or politics works differently. The spat or the well, the what's going on between Japan and China when the Japanese prime minister, the new prime minister, Mrs. Takaichi, foolishly said that a Chinese, attack on Taiwan would be an existential threat to Japan. And in my view, she said that without preparing it very much, and she said that
Yes.
without intending, without understanding the consequences, and it enraged the Chinese, and it crossed a counter reaction which I didn't expect. But it shows that over here in Asia, words still matter. If the United States says, I mean, the US can say tomorrow we will take the whole of Canada, and everybody will have a weird kind of laugh and then blah and blah blah blah. But over here, this actually matters. The meanings of words and the history that's connected to it, the Second World War memory and whatnot. And if the Japanese don't realize it, the Chinese do. It's just a different form of interaction, isn't it?
You're so right to point this out, right? Because you can say that the Chinese reaction has been a bit over the top, but you have to understand the Chinese political system and then the body politics of the messaging, right? So in China, when the leader of the country says something, then it is extremely powerful. That's why you would notice, the Chinese president nor premier never says anything outrageous when it comes to foreign policy. Never.
Yeah.
It's always vanilla. But it's also steeped in their belief in the sort of shared prosperity for humanity. And it's couched very carefully. But when I say vanilla, I mean it's not aggressive, but it's deeply thought through. And therefore, it's very important to understand. And I just wrote a piece last week around the complete sort of, dismissal of China's global governance initiative, which you may have seen. But it is a deeply thought through process to improve, not replace the UN system. But nobody knows about it. And since when I was doing some research, I found out that hardly anyone in the Western media has covered it. But it's a major initiative of the Chinese, but it's not being given any attention because it's not in the narrative of geopolitics and aggression and dominance. It's a very different sort of approach to what China sees as structural problems and bringing everyone to the table, because the Western media can't understand it. But that global governance initiative is backed by thousands of pages of detail in the Chinese system. It's been thought through by layers and layers. It's not the Politburo guys sat around and said, "Hey, you guys, why don't you write something like the new national security
Strategy.
strategic?" Yeah, by the U.S. government, which is all about dominance of the world and whatever.
Yeah,
So
one,
this is
two
the
people
difference in
paper. Yeah.
culture. This is the difference in culture. So when the Japanese prime minister, be either naive or wanting to make a bang, say something like that, for the Chinese, it is, oh my God, they really believe that. But it might just be a flippant, silly statement for political mileage, as she said. And she's having to, pay a price for it. But, at the same time, I believe the Chinese should reach out but it's not in the Chinese character to view something like that as
Yeah.
because when you say that and you particularly say something like that, a Chinese leader says, I would never say that. And if I did say that, that means we are going to do something about it.
Yeah. No, I mean it was a foolish comment, and like friends of mine, Japanese friends, said when they heard it, they believed it was like, oh, it slipped because they know she thinks like this, but they also know that she shouldn't be saying that because it's obviously not good, right? And but you see it the the expectations in a leader, right? That a leader is different from just a personality, right? Because the leader needs to have more things in common. And recently, 1.5 weeks ago, I was actually for the first time in China. I had never visited it, and I visited Shanghai, which you actually
Oh,
put on
wow,
the cover
really?
of your book.
Okay, good.
And I was just impressed. I mean, it was also impressed by how much the Shanghai also resembles Tokyo. There's so many things that
Yes.
you find again. So I just want to ask you, when we look at Asia, also as a geographical unit, do you think that we have all of these divisions, and we have problems between India and China and Japan and Korea and so on, but there's obviously some form of shared cultural approach to things, isn't there?
Oh yes, I mean this is the secret sauce we just need to put together, right?
Mm.
We need to bring this together. And I was doing an interview this morning with someone else, and I said about the book, and I said that in my view, the most consequential relationship, geopolitical relationship of the 21st century, would be between China and India.
Mm.
They represent, their influence throughout the region is everywhere. If you go to Indonesia, there's Hinduism, there's Buddhism,
Right.
there's Islam, and everything's there. And so the relationship needs to change, but we also have to recognize, and if you look at the Korean issue, etc., these were all sort of tensions, remnants of a different era, where the region was, 80% colonized or in some way or shape being dominated by foreign forces, etc. And so those tensions do not those the sort of implications of all those things have lingered for now, and now is the time it will change. And I really do think, as other commentators on Asia, particularly my good friend Kishore Mabihani and others have said, we have not, since the Vietnam War, had a major war. And, thankfully,
Thank God. Yeah.
no country has gone and dropped massive bombs on others. No country has. So, in that, I think there should be a lesson that we should observe the sort of diplomacy. And in the same way I talked about this morning or yesterday in another interview, that we need to reshape diplomacy. For too long, even in this part of the world, if there's a problem somewhere, we need some Norwegian, Scandinavian diplomat put together by the UN who has no idea of this part of the world. But it's apparently, as soon as a white man walks into the theater of conflict in Asia, we're all going to sit down and we're going to listen. I mean, this is the old colonial system. We're some of the best diplomats in the world in this part of the region. We have not leveraged them. So I think we also need, and diplomacy, I think you would agree, in Europe is a farce. Diplomacy is about all options on the table. You come on our side, or otherwise we may actually sanction you first. We may cripple your economy. And if you don't come to the table, even then we may bomb you. That's European and Western diplomacy. The rest of the world is very different. So I think you're right in saying, and I've always been saying this, we need to find that ability to have diplomats from this region. And I called for a school of diplomacy to be built in this part of the region. We send our diplomats to the John Hopkins School and the Kennedy School. I mean, what are we doing? What do the Americans know about diplomacy? And create a whole new infrastructure of diplomatic relations, but more importantly, schools of thought that would, as I said, build on the culture. And an important part of the culture is how not to lose face. It seems so simple, but probably living in Japan, that is one of the most important things. I may not like you, and we're going to talk, but what I shouldn't do is go on BBC and say, you're a scumbag. And I'm going to his country, but let's see if he's going to bow to me. And let's see how I can get the better. That's not the way it's done. And I remember, if I could give an example, when Malaysia had the new government, when the Prime Minister Mahathir came in, there was a lot of debt in Malaysia from Chinese overinvestments, etc. And the country was needing to claw back some of that money. Mahathir decided he would go to Beijing to negotiate. And in the Asian diplomatic realm of thinking, President Xi welcomed Mahathir. I mean, Malaysia is a sort of a pebble on the beach as far as China is concerned, a small economy. Uh, and I slightly exaggerate, but you know what I mean. But the Chinese leadership was, he's the elder statesman. We cannot, be abusive to the older man. He's extremely well learned, whether you like his politics or not. I don't agree with a lot of what he's done in the last few years, but that was the respect. They made a deal. President Xi welcomed him personally. And it's a small country. It was not like the United States president turned up. And I think this sort of, understanding the cultural context is something we should develop. I think China, India should embark on that because both have much in common in many ways, and find that and set an example for the rest of the world. And it's similarly with Cambodia and Thailand now, where we are having a bit of a conflict. I don't think we need Americans or anybody. We need good Singaporean diplomats, very good ones. There are many.
Malaysians, I mean,
Malaysian,
Donald Trump
well,
came in at the last moment to reap the benefits, but it was Malaysia that
Anwar Ibrahim, to his credit, had helped. And we don't need all of this. And in fact, the influence of the Americans and the Europeans, in my view, is it's an obstacle. We don't need them. And then we have to step up. So I think there is something there in a different way. And I'm sure it's the same in Africa. If you talk to Africans, they talk about their way of doing things. There's different ways.
Yeah.
But the story of international diplomacy has been carved out as the preserve of Western elite diplomats who travel around the world making peace because the natives can't get together. That's a kind of Tarzan and Jane kind of story. The world has moved on, and we need to recapture our traditions in the modern world and the customs and the ways of dealing with people so that we can actually, solve our own problems rather than rely on people from elsewhere.
And the good news here is that Asia already has a lot of good schools. Actually, you find them in China, you find them in Singapore, you find them in Japan. A lot of very good institutes actually that also do like south to south like education, right? And actually, China is a champion of also bringing Africans to study there, but also in Russia, and try to do cultural diplomacy with students as well. Japan does so too. We see how in Africa there are institutes created. One thing that I always admire about African colleagues is that they have much more of an appreciation of Africa as Africa, like beyond the colonially drawn lines, and even beyond the linguistic barriers. So there's a lot to build upon actually.
But we need to, these are all happening, as you say, but they're on the periphery. And what I'm saying is we need to bring it to the center. We need to recapture the space. That space, and unfortunately, it's dominated by Western diplomats who, with all due respect, need to butt out. And this view that those others can't do it is essentially, in my view, almost racist, and we need to reject it. But they won't butt out unless we take charge. And there, I think we need the best minds in Asia calling for the institutionalized of the Asian diplomacy, the African diplomacy, write the sort of narratives around what that looks like. I mean, how ridiculous is it to have Norwegians and Swedish diplomats, going to Myanmar to mediate? I mean, this is just old world nonsense.
I know, but it's difficult because there are good parts of these old colonial structures that are still thriving on exploiting the differences that there are. Go to Chiang Mai in Thailand, and according to one of my friends from there, the American consulate is humongous.
Oh yes, huge. I know, I know.
Hundreds of people. And it's like you don't need that many diplomats in Chiang Mai, but maybe you can do a lot of good work with a lot of CIA agents that then go over the Golden Triangle and into Myanmar and do like whatever CIA agents do over there. And you cannot just unroot that. You cannot just throw that out, unfortunately. So it's all part. It's part of this D
No,
West.
it's very old. It's very old, and our many of our current leaders are still steeped in that subservience and to the economic also power of
Oh yes,
those colonial outposts there. And I was just talking to a friend just 2 days ago about how all of this works. The amount of scholarships being given by various United European and American institutions to young scholars, etc., in Asia, as though we're peasants, to go. And of course, if you're 28, you've done a master's in political science, and you get a scholarship through USAID, the embassy, to go to Harvard for 2 weeks to be brainwashed. You will go there, and there are numerous, because this is how you capture minds. And I spoke about this before.
yeah.
I'm not saying that we should reject all of this. But I'm saying we should have alternatives. That if you had the best school for global governance and diplomacy based out of Jakarta or in Tokyo or in Hong Kong, then the world starts to change. You will get Americans and Europeans benefiting from coming to this part of the world and understanding, or in Dubai. But the old world and the money needs to be given to it. But we have not thought that. So that's our fault too. We have not thought about how to do this
The,
stuff.
the Japanese have a beautiful system, they just rain scholarships on people who want to come and study in Japan, right? And that's like they just rain it down there without the whole like, oh, and then assessment and impact and blah 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 blah. It's just like, okay, money for students to survive, not a lot. You will never swim in money, but you will survive in the city, and then you can do 2 3 years. That's I mean they paid me a scholarship as a Swiss to come and study in Japan and do the PhD here. I mean that's just that's how you get this kind of exchange. So I hope other countries will, and they're already doing.
But
China
but
does so.
yeah, but don't underestimate, and that's the transition in the way decolonization happens. But don't underestimate the power, the capture of the mind. That if you dangle a Japanese scholarship and a U.S. or a UK scholarship in front of a student in Malaysia, guess
Right,
which one you're going to pick? And that's how the mind works, right? It's Cambridge, I'm going there. I'm not going to Japan. And it's very powerful. And we have to decolonize the mind, but we have to build the institutions. And I think that's my main point about
right.
peace, diplomacy. We cannot, linger and look at OECD reports and all of that, which are all skewed through the lens of just the Western experience. And I think coming back to what my book talks about is essentially China, one of the things I talk about in the book is China a force for good or not? And that's a whole chapter on that in terms of providing a global good. All right. And I don't try and say China is or China isn't. I just try and give people the facts so that they can discern. And one area is, of course, the cultural influence as well. And how would China leverage its soft power? Which goes beyond, selling a soft drink like Coca-Cola or something, the Chinese version. What is the soft power? These are very important things to understand in terms of when we speak about what's the global good of a country
Right.
when it rises. And the global good that the United States were granted to was the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which had started to abuse. Right, post Second World War, it provided a security net in certain parts of the world, which is then abused. And so what would China do is something I talk about in the book, and I think the Chinese are very careful about how they embark on that, given that there are a lot of potholes along that journey, because the stronger you become, the more arrogant you can become, and you can create a lot of enemies
Yep.
even unwittingly. And that's one of the things the book talks about, how careful it has to be.
Yep. There is great danger in success. We are seeing it live at the moment with the West, right? Um, Chandran, this was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much for that. People who want to read your book, it will be linked in the description below. It's called Understanding China: Governance, Socioeconomics, Global Influence. Is there another place where people should find you?
They can find me on our website, the Global Institute for Tomorrow website, www.gift-ad.com. Sorry.
I'll put that too into the description box below. We'll talk again. Chandran Nair, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me back. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.